Hi, Dr. Gabor.
Hello, Lubna. Nice to see you.
Nice to see you too. How are you today?
I'm well. I'm just back from a 3-day California speaking trip on top
Great.
of a 3-week European speaking trip.
Yes.
So I'm probably overdoing it, but otherwise I'm good. Thank you.
Well, we're very grateful to have you with us. Dr. Gabor, the audience today are professionals, mainly CEOs, HR leaders, mental health professionals, VCs, investors, just so you have an idea about the audience.
Sure.
And we're focusing on mental health in the workplace and purpose. So I have a list of questions for you, if it's okay for me to perhaps dive right in and ask you some questions related to your book, The Myth of Normal, and within the context of the workplace. Would it be
Please go
okay
ahead.
if I go ahead and start?
Jump right in.
Amazing. So in your book, you talk about trauma, illness, and healing in a toxic culture. And as you know, there are many toxic workplaces and many leaders and people that are in these workplaces, and they make the choice to stay given their situation at home or whatever, for whatever reason. What is, in your view, the solution to toxic workplaces?
Well, first of all, let's begin with the acknowledgement that I don't think anybody ever intends to be toxic. That's not their intention. Their intention is to maximize profit or to enhance the efficiency of the organization as they see it, perhaps legitimately to advance their own careers and so on. But it's not their intention to bully or to be toxic or to oppress anybody. That nobody wakes up and says, "How am I going to do all those things?" In other words, the toxicity, when it's present, arises from some structural problems. And the structural problem is that as human beings, we have certain needs. We're born with these needs. These needs are not arbitrary, they're not purely subjective, they're dictated by evolution. So children have some basic needs to be accepted for exactly who they are, not to have their parents' agenda thrust upon them, to be valued for who they are, not because of what they do, what they achieve, how they look, how smart they are, but just because they exist. To have all their emotions validated and accepted and mirrored by the adults. So these are some fundamental children's needs that in this society, for a lot of reasons, are ignored and even trampled upon, which means that people's relationship with each other is already, and Sophie um, Gregoire points out this in her book, is that those early relationships then often form a template for later relationships. So a lot of us enter the school world and the work world with our sense of relationship and our connection to ourselves already distorted.
Mm.
So that's one of the primary problems. And we tend to be more goal oriented and external achievement oriented than being true to our true selves. So that's one problem. It starts right off in childhood. Now then you come to adulthood in the workplace. Adults have needs too, human needs that have been studied by great psychologists for a long time. They are for a sense of belonging, a sense of community, sense of meaning, purpose, and autonomy, which means that they're not just chess pieces being moved around by somebody else. So these are genuine human needs that are kind of built, you might say, into our nature. We can function if those needs are frustrated, but we're not at our best. On the contrary. So that's on the one hand. So we have these human needs that are dictated by evolution that, for all those eons of millions and hundreds of thousands of years of human existence, um, people lived in community. The children spent the whole day with the adults. Um, I just reread a really interesting book called The Continuum Concept, which was an American writer visiting or living with the Stone Age tribe in the Venezuelan jungle back in the 1970s, 80s. Now, these people have no word for work.
Mm,
They have a word for chopping wood or fishing or planting or washing, but no word for work. In other words, they're not alienated from what they do. They just do what they do.
mm,
There's no question of work life balance because there's no separation.
mm,
Now, then you come to the modern economy where the ultimate motive is profit and efficiency. Companies, by and large, they don't tend to think about what are the emotional and human needs of their employees. They think about what do we need from these employees to achieve our corporate goal, which is maximization of profit, perhaps expansion,
mm,
efficiency, whatever. But autonomy, that's not a consideration in a lot of companies. Now, if you look at what stresses human beings, if you look at the stress literature, what stresses human beings are, and when I say stress, I mean stress that releases the stress hormones in the body and puts you in an agitated state, are uncertainty, lack of information, loss of control, and conflict. So look at any workplace and evaluate it from the point of view how much control do people have over the conditions of their work or even the content of their work? How much autonomy do they have or the lack of it? How much information are they working with? Are decisions made from the top and imposed on the everybody below? Or is there an exchange of information where people feel a part of the information flow, not just recipients or subjects of decisions made by others? So, what I'm saying is that there's kind of a built, not because of anybody's intent to create toxicity, but simply because of the built in contradiction between human needs on the one hand and a lot of corporate or business situations on the other. And then, of course, I just mentioned one final fact is that the people who tend to succeed, who tend to get rewarded, are precisely the people that know how to maximize profit and efficiency. But they're the ones who tend to be the most, on the whole, they tend to be the most aggressive and the most self centered and the most goal oriented and the least aware of the human needs of their fellow workers. That's my sense of it. So there's a kind of a built-in problem. So, and I'll stop here, okay, and let you take it from there. I hope that's clear enough.
Yes, it is. So do you have is there a quick fix solution in your view, or is it something like where do we start by fixing this issue?
Well, um, there's no quick fix, and the whole idea of a quick fix is a typically largely North American compulsion to be a quick. No, there's no quick fix.
Mm,
Um, First, we have to understand the problem, and so the first question is: are leaders willing to look at their company culture from the eyes of perspective of human needs? Are they even willing to do that? Are they
mhm,
willing to consider how to reconcile their legitimate business goals with the emotional human needs of the people that they work with? That's the first thing. The second thing is, if you look at the title of um, Sophie's book, it's called Closer Together, Knowing Ourselves, Loving Each Other. So what she's pointing out in the very title of the book is that to be closer together, we have to know ourselves. So, how much willingness is there on the part of, like, I used to be a very successful doctor. I was a workaholic doctor. I mean, people loved me, and not that I didn't make any mistakes, but on the whole, I was good at what I did. But I was driving myself out of a workaholic tendency, ignoring my own emotional needs, and ignoring the emotional needs of my family. So it took a lot of work of self-knowledge to begin to turn that around. And the world, of course, rewards you for ignoring your own needs.
Absolutely.
And then it shows up in the form of dysfunction. Like there's a lot of drinking culture and so on. People just drink to deal with the stress rather than deal with the stress. They drink to soothe the impacts of the stress. So I would ask, never mind the quick fix. The question is, what questions are we willing to ask? And to what degree are we willing to look at ourselves and then examine ourselves and ask myself, what is my real intention here? Is it to
Mm,
enhance my ego, my status,
mm.
or is it to really get to know myself and to bring that self-knowledge into all areas of my existence? So I think it's not the quick fix that's the question here. The question is, what questions are we willing to really examine honestly and fearlessly?
And also living from the inside out, especially with leaders. I think there's leaders have a role to actually invest in their own self-development and in looking at themselves. I think it's crucial that every leader does that. Yeah,
It's crucial, but if you actually look at it, how many do? And because when they do, it might lead them to question how they're living their lives and
mm,
how they're conducting themselves in a workplace.
absolutely. And I've seen some people who don't really want to look at that or cannot handle looking at that. I've experienced that on my journey as a coach.
Yeah,
You mentioned something that's really interesting. And you say that in chapter 32 of your book, we all deserve to know our purpose in life. Um, and I'm curious because as a company, we would love to put together a book as a summary of this conference and have some parts about purpose. If we could ask you to come up with a purpose or a statement or a formula about how an individual can find their purpose, what would you say it is?
well, it's not for me to dictate to anybody else how to find their own purpose, but it does take a pause.
Mm,
It does take a pause. And here's a question you should put to yourself.
mm,
Everybody, all of us. When you leave this earth, what footprint would you have wished to have left? That you made a lot of money? That you impressed a lot of people? Um, if that's the footprint you want to leave, live like that. But I don't think most people would say that. Most people, if they put their hands on their heart and say, what footprint do I want to leave on the earth? They'd come with something, they'd come up with something more meaningful, more personal. Then the question is, if that's a footprint I want to leave after I'm no longer here, then what kind of a life do I want to lead between now and then? Because let's face it, folks, we don't have that much time on this earth, And there was a book published in Australia by a palliative care nurse who worked with dying people. That's work that I did as a physician for a number of years. I worked with dying people, and this book was called "The Top 5 Regrets of Dying People." And the top
mm,
regret was, I wish I'd had the courage to be myself.
mm,
One of them was, I wish I hadn't worked so hard.
mm.
I wish I had been true to my own emotions. I wish I spent more time with my friends. I wish I had allowed myself more to be happy, to be playful, to be joyful. Now, do we want to be on our deathbed and have those regrets? I mean, I know that's a kind of dire way to put it, but I'm asking you if you, if you want to find a meaning in your life, put your hand on your heart and ask yourself, what footprint do you want to have left on the earth after you're no longer here?
I love that. And you're getting a lot of love from our audience. So thank you for that. And I've had firsthand experience in exactly what you are saying. I grew up in a war zone in Beirut, and from the age of 8, I grew up to being obsessed with purpose. I've read every single book on this earth about purpose, and I've always said, at the end of the day, everything is replaceable except that story you leave behind. And that's, I
Mm.
think, a perfect transition to the next question, because we talk a lot, and you say that in your book also in chapter 29 about our stories. We all are functioning based on these stories that we have in our head. And sometimes these stories are not real, they're not based on reality, they're just based on belief systems that we got from our childhood or from society. Um, how, or can you maybe recommend to the audience how they could shift their inner story in a brief way?
Well, the stories is not that they're not based on reality. They're based on reality, but then they are covered over by your interpretation of reality.
Mm,
So I'll give you a personal example that I've often talked about, but it kind of sums it up. So just to make a long story short, at age 11 month, at age 11 month, my mother gave me to a total stranger in the street, a Christian woman. This is under the Nazi occupation in Hungary's Second World War, December of 1944. I'm 11 months of age, and she gave me to this stranger. She did that to save my life because she didn't know if she'd be alive for another day or two. And I was hungry and sick, and she couldn't keep me alive. So it gives me to this total stranger, and I didn't see her for 6 weeks. Now, all my life, that has left a bitterness in me, the bitterness of abandonment and the unfairness of life and how cruel this world is, which is totally understandable. But it is an interpretation.
mm,
Actually, from another point of view, imagine the love and the courage and the self sacrifice it took for a 24-year-old young woman to hand her baby to a total stranger in the street. Imagine the love and the courage and the humanity of that unknown Christian woman who took me to a safer place. So I could look at the same event and interpret it as the only way the infant can interpret it, as one of abandonment and a terrible world. Or from a more healed and holistic place, I can look at the same event as an act of tremendous love on the part of the universe. The
absolutely.
facts haven't changed, but it's the interpretation, the perception. So my story was based in reality, and but it was the only interpretation as an infant and a young child I could make of the story. So it's not so much the reality that has to change, but we have to question our interpretations. We have to question our perceptions. It's our perception, and the Buddha said 2,500 years ago that is with our minds that we create the world. But again, as Sophie points out in her book, is that before the world, and I point out in my books, is that before the mind that we have creates the world creates our minds because of our early imprints. And it's that early stuff and how that interpreted, how that imprinted on us and the interpretations that we develop. That's what we have to question because that's what gets us into trouble. So we can't be in the present moment and we're still looking at the present through the unconscious eyes of a wounded child.
Thank you. That was beautiful. Dr. Gabor, our time is almost up, and I want to make sure that I give some people the chance to ask you a question. Before I do that, I know that you're I know you from the CI world to be very joyful and very playful. So I have, would you rather questions, and it's either or, so you can't pick both. I'm just going to ask them really, really quickly, if that's okay. And I would love to hear your answer to them. Are you ready to play?
I'm ready to play.
Let's go. All right. Purpose or profit?
Purpose or purpose?
Authenticity or attachment?
Authenticity.
Meditation or movement?
For me, movement.
An
I, I,
extra
med-
hour.
I meditate when I'm swimming.
All right. An extra hour of sleep or an extra hour of doing something you love?
At this point, I'll take sleep.
Okay. Wealth or mental health?
Oh, is that even a question?
It is for some in the context of a workplace, but I hear your answer.
Yeah.
If you could give your 8-year-old advice today in very brief, a few words, what would you say?
My 8-year-old,
Yeah, your 8-year-old self.
don't take on those problems as your own.
Mm,
Do your best, but don't carry a burden.
I love that. And I know that in Compassionate Inquiry, you love to share quotes and pull up quotes. So if you have one quote that you live by, which would it be?
Oh, it'd be do you want me to find it on my cell phone?
If you
Because
like.
yeah, it just takes me a second. Um, well, you know what? I don't want to waste your time searching my cell phone, but it's by Almas, A.H. Almas, who was one of my teachers, and he says that I'm paraphrasing him, but the most difficult and challenging things in your life are sent to you by a part of you that wants to teach you. So that these challenges that we face, we can look at them as misfortunes, purely as misfortunes, or we can ask, what's the teaching in it? Because there's a part of us that wants us to wake up. And you're going to run into a lot of blind alleys. And this part of you is going to keep poking you. Wake up. That's not the right way. And it says, that part that loves you more than anything else will make you suffer greatly if you don't listen. What else can it do? That's its job. And what that means is that when we face difficulties and challenges in our personal lives, health challenges, relationship issues, depressions, anxieties, work failure, or a success at work that still leaves you empty and turns to ashes in your mouth,
Mm,
that's a part of you leading you somewhere to teach you something. So, can we be open to the teaching of the experience that life has given us? That's my favorite quote.
beautiful.
I paraphrased it, but that's the meaning of it.
I love it. And I know that you also end your book with talking about how we all need to wake up, saying that this is our biggest challenge and our biggest opportunity at the same time. I love that. I'm
That's right.
going to make way for people to ask questions. I think there has been a lot of people that have written in the Q&A chat and have raised their hand. I'm wondering if my team can bring up somebody. I'm hoping at this point that we have somebody. If my team...
Hello. So I think we have a question that has been submitted by El Hanouf. So what I'm
Okay,
going to do is I will pull up El Hanouf and I ask you as soon as you have um, been pulled up as a panelist, please switch on your camera and your audio so that we can hear you.
thank you.
All right.
Do we have her with us? Do we have El Hanouf with us?
Yes, we do. And she just needs to accept the request to be a panelist. Great.
Hey guys, can you hear me?
And Hanouf, can we see you?
Yes.
Is it possible for us to see you?
Apologies, I can't have my camera on right now, but can
Okay.
you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Amazing. So thank you, Lubna, for this, and thank you, Dr. Gaber, for joining. I just have one question about procrastination and how can we kind of heal it in a way that we understand what the root cause of it, because most people say that it's self-sabotage. So
Procra-
I would like your take, Dr. Gaber, on it. Thank you so much.
Procrastination?
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't believe in self-sabotage. People often use that because it looks like it. We're behaving in ways that undermine our purpose or our intentions. But nobody sets out deliberately to sabotage themselves. Procrastination is a matter of motivation. It's a matter either of I'm overstressed and I can't take on one more thing, or I'm not really into this. So if somebody procrastinates, rather than berating themselves and criticizing themselves for procrastinating, let them ask themselves, am I really motivated? Do I really want to do this? Or is it just a should that somebody else is imposing on me or that I'm imposing on myself? Am I really ready for this? Or is my plate already full and I just don't want to take up one more thing? In other words, if you're procrastinating, so called, be compassionate to yourself and ask yourself some questions as to what's really going on for you rather than criticizing yourself for procrastinating.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Gabor. We'll go for the next question now. Nadine, if you could pick somebody from the Q&A and
Yes,
ask them on screen, please.
sure. So we have got Shauna Ray. If you can please put your hand up so that we can easily identify you. Shauna, there you are. And I will make you a panelist so that you can ask your question live to Dr. Gabor. If I can ask you, yes, please, to mute. Yes, thank you.
Hi there. I asked a couple of questions and I didn't know which one you wanted me to refer to. One was about information and journalism and another was about humanity.
So
Well,
we have a good question from you about how to look to others to validate our existence.
Right. Okay. So, yes, I was going to ask, often we look, well, I mean, we're conditioned to look to other people to validate us regularly, whether that is validate our success, validate our performance, validate our parenting, whatever it is. And so I believe, and I'm learning as an older person as I heal, that I'm the only person that I need to validate anything with. But where does the external validation need come from? Thank you.
well, I don't know if you remember the song by Ricky Nelson, Garden Party. Mary says, it's all right now. I learned my lesson well. You can't please everyone, so you got to please yourself. That's what he sings in that song. Now, the need for external validation comes from early childhood when you weren't valued for who you were, just for existing. Children have a need to be valued just for existing, not because of what they do, as I said this before, not because of what they do, because how they look, how smart they are, how compliant, how cute, how cuddly they are, just because they are. If the parents are present enough and emotionally attuned enough, which in this society a lot of parents are not due to their own fault, but they're just not, then the child needs to find validation by earning it somehow. The child who's given those conditions will value themselves intrinsically. So I mentioned this book called The Continuum Concept. And what she says in that book is that children in that society where they're held everywhere, they go by the adults and they're always around the adults, and the adults don't hit them or punish them. They just trust in the child, and the child trusts in the adults. People grow up with a sense of their own goodness. But so few of us in this culture grow up with a sense of our own goodness. So it comes from early deprivation of being valued just for your existence. And then you have to keep validating yourself through the eyes of others, which means that a lot of us live a life in the minds of other people. So
Thank
what
you.
people think of us, what they, and of course the social media has just metastasized that phenomenon. So many people live or die daily by what other people say about them. It all goes back to that early lack of validation.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
I'm very, very honored to introduce the next segment right now and introduce Sophie Gregoire Trudeau, who is with us. And I'm sure that all of you know Sophie Gregoire Trudeau. It is an honor, and I'm very grateful to have you with us, Sophie. Sophie is a best-selling author and mental health advocate. And we're very blessed she's joining us to talk about her new book, Closer Together, as we observe World Mental Health Awareness Day this week. And over the past 20 years, Sophie has been involved in a variety of causes as a speaker, interviewer, and an advocate. Thank you for joining us, Sophie. And we're going to play your introductory video just before we have you come on screen for a second. Nadine, if we can please play that.
In a time when the world feels further apart, we need to draw closer together. Helping those who suffer from eating disorders led to a passion for helping anyone who wants to improve their mental health. It's become a core part of who I am. As a mental health, emotional literacy, and gender equality advocate for the past 2 decades, I've discovered more about human emotions than I ever thought I would. Wherever you are in your life right now, know that every day can be a new beginning. We can rewire our brains and mend our hearts. It's all possible, but it's not easy. And it shouldn't be. But together, we meet in ways that can help us heal and cope, no matter what struggles we are facing individually. From beginning to end, we are never strangers. Let us come closer together. I hope to meet you on the path.
Beautiful video by a beautiful human. I'm so honored to have you, Sophie.
It's my honor. Thank you for your playfulness. Thank you for your deep insight. I'm happy to join. And Gabor, thank you for your very courteous and kind ways of referring to my book. It just means a lot. But most of all, I'm just happy to meet all of you, friends and allies. It means a lot for me to be here today. And if I may just say that when you were talking about the footprint, I kept wanting to play with you guys and say, heartprint. What is the heartprint that we want to leave?
Okay.
But a lot of our, biology is holding us back in our own trauma and stories. So we need to know how to not be held back by it and understand it better. So thank you for having me.
Thank you so
Well,
much. I'm going to leave you and let you stay on screen together, and I will come back in 20 minutes if that's okay, so you can have a conversation together. And if it's okay, I'll come back and interrupt you in about 20 minutes and transition to the next segment and take questions. Thank you so much.
Okay, well, speaking of heartprint, so let me ask you a difficult question. So you wrote this book, Closer Together. There it is. I think I'm showing it. So I'm going to ask you sort of an arrogant question, okay?
I don't know you enough to know that you can be arrogant. Go ahead.
Why did you write this book? I mean, there's all these millions of books out there already on mental health, including by yours truly and a whole lot of other people that you interviewed. What did you want to do that only you could do? Like, what is your heartprint here that you wanted to create with this book?
You know what? To show and to share my respect for humanity and human beings and my fellow citizens and my fellow sisters and brothers. I wrote it because it came from a place of coherence and of integrity, where I decided in my own life path that I wanted to sit with the inconvenience of truth and be able to understand it better. And it is inconvenient because it hurts. But when we're not brought up to actually, be in solitude with our pain. I decided that I want to do that. And this is not just my work, my book. It would be completely condescending and arrogant to say that, this belongs to me. I think that this work belongs to everybody. And this is why I wrote the book, to be able to give the tools and give the science and make it accessible so people have the right to self-knowledge. They have the right to be able to turn inside of them without feeling panicked or scared, because so many of us do. And I'm going to return this question to you by asking, I just heard this morning when I was doing a course on the biology of trauma, that trauma is not psychology, it is biology.
Yeah, well, it's both.
So it sets into our bodies, whether it's your work, Bessel van der Kolk's, or and then our psychology interprets it from our bodily states. So what would you say to that trauma is not just psychology, but it's also biology?
Well, the truth there is that human beings are not divisible. You can't separate the mind from the body. So very obviously, if I were to scream at you right now, that would create certain emotions, and those emotions would translate into physiology immediately. Your heart rate might go up, your muscles might tense, your blood pressure would go up, certain blood vessels would constrict, others would open up more. So that's just an obvious example of how emotions immediately affect the physiology. So when we are hurt, and in trauma, we are hurt, we're wounded. That's what the word trauma means. So when we are wounded emotionally, that immediately translates into, not that it translates into, it's happening on all levels. So that the immune system and the emotional system and the nervous system and the hormonal apparatus are not separate systems. And the trouble is that this unity of mind and body, now, I often quote this. Socrates, 2,500 years ago, said that the problem with the doctors of today is that they separate the mind from the body. Well, we're still doing that. And what I'm saying is, you actually, and I'll just finish that answer by quoting citing the indigenous concept of health. So in the North American indigenous teachings, there's something called the medicine wheel, and health rests on the medicine wheel, which is 4 quadrants. There's the physical, our bodies, our physiology. There's the mental, which is our thoughts and our emotions. There's the social, which means our relationships with each other and with the universe and other creatures. And then there's the spiritual, which is a sense of belonging and being connected with something much greater than just a little egos. Now, from their perspective, health resides in a balance between those 4 quadrants. Not only is that a beautiful metaphor, scientifically, it's also the only valid way to look at human beings. So that's why trauma is physiological as much as is anything else.
I learned not too long ago that Abraham Maslow, that famous pyramid that we know, the safety, the physiological needs, and it ends with self-actualization. Maslow actually spent time with indigenous communities. I think it's the Blackfeet, and he studied their models of behavior in society and interactions, and noticed that actually self-actualization wasn't at, if he had to do a pyramid of what he learned about them, wouldn't be at the top of the pyramid, it would be at the base of it. Thinking and suggesting that in some indigenous communities, it is thought that self-actualization not only is innate, but is supported in every other need by community. So if we're asking today, how do we help leaders become more self-regulated, become more self-aware, if they don't pause between that bad phase that you wanted to give me, Gabor, just to test my bodily responses, or if a leader is screaming at an employee or vice versa, to be able to pause, and you said that earlier, to be able to pause right after we notice our bodily states, when we work, when we love, when we play, when we are in interactions with our loved ones, our family members, our coworkers, whatever it is. That pause how necessary is it in order to react to life in a more conscious way?
Well, let me give you an answer and then ask you a question in response. There's a quote that's often attributed to the psychiatrist Viktor Frankl, who survived Auschwitz, and he wrote this book called Man's Search for Meaning. But he didn't actually say it. It was somebody else who said it. It was the American psychologist Rollo May who said that between stimulus and response, there's a gap. And in that gap is our freedom to choose our response. Now, very often what happens in trauma is we lose that gap. So there's a stimulus and we just react. And that reaction is based on some past programming. So that as much as we think we're free, if that gap that you refer to isn't there, there's no freedom in it. And so often in my life, and even recently, like I was speaking at a conference, somebody asked me a question and I lost the gap because the question was so emotionally close to me that I just allowed myself to get triggered. And then I had to work my way back to develop the gap and come back and address the issue differently. The question that arises for me is, in your first statement or the second statement, you talked about inconvenient truth. And it's the fear of those truths that makes us not pause. So why is the truth so inconvenient?
Love your question. And by the way, I hope later you can tell us which question got you so emotional. I'm curious to know how you got touched that way. It's a beautiful, situation to be in a way with the work that you're doing. So what makes us so afraid of the truth? I think I'm going to take exactly what we're talking about and just go one step even deeper. You listen to a lot of music, Gabor. You love poetry. I love poetry. Not too long ago, I was going for a walk. And usually I don't put anything in my ears, but this time I listened to a podcast and I love poets. And this time it was David White. And he said that one of our greatest ways to become conscious, mature, growing beings is to become a full citizen of our solitude. Our solitude, to be able to sit with ourselves in silence without feeling overwhelmed. And there's a difference between solitude and loneliness. Except here's the thing. How is it that we can feel safe enough if we haven't looked at the biology and at the root of our trauma to sit with our solitude when we live in a society where we live so fast, so out of touch with others, so glued to our screens? Maybe we were not allowed and we were not re-given this opportunity and this human right to self-knowledge, which goes through solitude. Slowing down, listening to the body, being able to look at one another without feeling threatened by the difference of other people. This happens when we feel fragile. Fragile means not feeling calm to sit with our solitude. And I have chills just talking about this because poetry, music, art, which are universal languages, not only speaks to our minds, but it speaks to our souls, to our nervous systems. Because how else would you get people in apartheid in South Africa to be together beside maybe a sporting match? Or how else would you get people through music from all political stripes who are actually fighting in real life to listen to a concert in peace? This is happening as we speak. So I would say solitude versus loneliness is where health and wisdom compared to hypervigilance, hyper-alertness, constant stress modes because of the way that we live in. And you say this all the time, Gabor. We are reacting normally to abnormal circumstances. So our little almond-shaped amygdala in our alert system in our brain is doing its work. But what we're doing is that we're putting all the brakes on it and on our bodies with high cortisol, high dopamine, circumstances and ways of living. And then we're lowering from a biological level our levels of serotonin, feel-good hormone, oxytocin, cuddling hormone, We need these. We are still the little children that want to be taken care of as adults, but depending on how we take care of ourselves and how we can sit with our solitude and marry that in a melancholic poetry, because we are here for a short time, as you say so well. I guess that would be the dance, the real dance.
Well, listen, so because you talk about poetry and you talk about solitude, let me give you one of my favorite quotes from one of my favorite poets, okay? This is Rainer Maria Rilke in his letters to a young poet. And this is what he says: do not allow yourself to be confused in your aloneness by the something within you that wishes to be released from it. This very wish, if you will calmly and deliberately use it as a tool, will help you expand your solitude into far distant realms. He says, people have, with the help of so many conventions, resolved everything the easy way, on the easiest side of the easy. But it is clear that we must embrace struggle. Every living thing conforms to it. Everything in nature grows and struggles in its own way, establishing its own identity, insisting on it at all costs against all resistance. So he's actually tying the willingness to accept solitude with the struggle to be fully ourselves, which he says is our true nature and our true purpose.
I could weep very easily right now, because I think that whoever's listening, you know, we all have a story. We're all one trauma away from each other. It takes one dramatic life event to change your brain, to change the way you perceive yourself, the way you interact with this world, and how you see this dance between the light and the darkness, between your solitude and your loneliness, and how you can find your way through that middle ground, right? That place of home that we want to call home so badly, as being a child or as being a grown child. And I think that what we're doing now is that we're learning to reparent ourselves, not to point the finger and say, oh, my parents didn't do this, they didn't do that. Yes, we do have to be conscious of, as parents and as mentors and as leaders, to not repeat and to not leave our trauma unresolved, because we're going to leave that emotional legacy onto our kids, who already have their work to do of finding their own solitude and be tuned into themselves and trust themselves, trust their bodies, trust themselves. And, you know, because now our kids are on screen so much, we're kind of impairing the development of the brain, because we're not allowing them to experience those periods of low risk, low cost years where they fall off their bike. They'll be fine. There's no parent going, oh my God, you're going to die, my child, right? So, and many other examples we could use. We need to build more, not only biological resilience, but psychological resilience. And I think that has to go through solitude. And the reason why I laughed when you shared your quote, it was a laughter of compassion and of tenderness, because one of my favorite quotes that I do want to share right now, and maybe you can comment on it, is from Rainer Maria Rilke. And it says, I want to unfold. Let there be no space inside me held closed, for where I am closed, I am false. For where I am closed, I am false. And this brings me straight into your work when, Gabor, you talk about the fact that the difference between suffering and trauma, that suffering and pain is part of life. It's not dangerous. Trauma is when a constriction happens, something closes. Can you elaborate on this?
Yeah, sure. So, as the Buddha pointed out 2,500 years ago, life is suffering. Not all life is suffering, but life brings suffering because there's loss. People die. Your pet dog will die before you do. You know, you recently endured the death of your father. You know, and so life is going to bring loss. We are wired for grief. In our brain, there's circuitry for grief. In our brain, there's circuitry for panic. When should we panic? If an infant is left alone and not picked up when they're crying, they can experience panic, which will cause them to scream even louder, which ideally should bring the parents running to pick them up. Now, when that doesn't happen, then being alone is associated with fear. And in our society, a lot of parents are told not to pick up the kids when they're crying. And you tell a mother cat or a mother bear to ignore the baby's distress, but human beings are trained not to. So then, when we're not allowed to move through all the emotions that life will inevitably evoke in us and for which our brains are wired, then later on in life, aloneness is associated with fear. Whereas solitude, I mean, my friend Gordon Neufeld, wonderful psychologist who you interviewed for your book, he once said jokingly that the only time I would send a kid to his room is when he says that he's bored. You know, then he says, then go and play and find something to do, you know, rather than here's a toy. You know,
No,
so
you know what? When my kids tell me that, Mom, I'm so bored, I said, if you're bored, it's because you're boring.
yeah. And
Yeah.
so I think Lubna, I think you're back on now.
Hi, thank you so much for this wonderful conversation.